On the morning of the 22nd of August, 1986, a farmer named Joseph Nkwain stepped out of his house in the village of Subum in northwestern Cameroon and began to walk down the path toward the road. He did not get very far. The first body he saw was a cow lying in the grass. The second body was his neighbour. The third was a child. By the time he reached the edge of the village, he had counted dozens, and within an hour he understood that something in the night had killed everyone he had ever known, and almost everything that breathed within a radius of 25 kilometres of his home. The death toll, when the international rescue teams arrived 3 days later, was 1,746 people, 3,500 head of livestock, birds in the trees, insects in the fields, fish in the streams. The cause was not war, it was not disease, it was not a flood. The cause was a lake on the side of a sleeping volcano, 20 kilometers uphill, that had, without warning and without precedent in the recorded experience of any human civilization, exhaled a column of carbon dioxide gas large enough to suffocate a country. The lake's name was Nyos, and the night it nearly killed Joseph Nkwain, the night his daughter died in his arms while he watched, paralyzed, unable to speak, was the first time in the modern scientific record that anybody had ever seen what a body of water can do when it has been quietly storing pressure for 1,000 years. To understand what happened at Lake Nyos, you have to understand a particular kind of geography. Cameroon in West-Central Africa sits on a long crack in the Earth's crust called the Cameroon Volcanic Line. It runs for 1,600 kilometers from the island of Pagalu in the Gulf of Guinea to the Mandara Mountains on the border with Nigeria. Along that line, there are some 40 volcanoes. Most of them have not erupted in centuries. Many of them have crater lakes at their summits, deep, cold pools of fresh water, sitting inside the bowls of long-extinct calderas. Lake Nyos is one of these. It occupies a crater roughly 1,500 meters across and just over 200 meters deep. The water in the upper layer is cool and oxygenated. The water in the lower layer, below about 50 meters, is colder, denser, and almost completely without oxygen. It has been undisturbed, more or less continuously, for centuries. And it is into that lower layer, slowly, year by year, that the volcanic activity beneath the lakebed has been venting carbon dioxide gas. In a normal body of water, dissolved gas escapes back to the surface. The water mixes, currents move it, temperature shifts, seasonal turnover lifts the bottom water to the top, releases its contents to the atmosphere, and sinks again. Lake Nyos does not mix. Its lower layer is so cold and so dense that nothing dislodges it. The water at the bottom simply absorbs the carbon dioxide as it arrives, like a soda bottle that nobody has opened. The pressure of the water above keeps the gas in solution. The dissolved concentration over time builds up. By August 1986, it has been estimated the bottom of Lake Nyos contained somewhere between 300 and 400 million cubic meters of carbon dioxide, held in place, in the dark, under 200 meters of cold water by nothing more than the weight of the lake itself. There had been a warning 2 years earlier, on the 15th of August 1984, at another crater lake about 100 kilometers south, called Lake Manoon. The same thing, or a very small version of the same thing, had happened. 37 people died. The villagers downhill from the lake reported a faint smell, a low sound during the night, and a silence the following morning. The Cameroonian government commissioned a study. The study concluded that the deaths had been caused by an unusual rapid release of dissolved carbon dioxide. The conclusion was published. It was filed. It was not acted upon. Nobody at the time considered the possibility that what had happened at Manoon could happen on a much larger scale at Nyos. We do not know with certainty what triggered the release. The leading hypotheses are three. The first is a landslide. A wall of the crater, eroded by years of rainfall, collapsed into the deep water and disturbed it sufficiently to begin the chain reaction. The second is a small volcanic eruption on the lake bed. A pulse of hot gas from below, even a brief one, would heat a column of bottom water, reduce its density, and start it rising. The third is an internal wave, a slow oscillation in the temperature layers that simply, by accident of geometry, on that particular night, brought a critical mass of supersaturated water close enough to the surface for the carbon dioxide to begin to come out of solution. What is not in dispute is what happened next. Once a quantity of the deep water rose by several meters, the pressure on it decreased. Carbon dioxide bubbles began to form. The water, now containing bubbles, became lighter than the water above it. It rose further. As it rose, the pressure dropped further, and more bubbles formed. The process is, in the literal sense, the same as opening a bottle of champagne. It is a chain reaction. Within a period that has been estimated as 2 to 4 minutes, the entire lower 100 meters of the lake essentially erupted into the air. A column of water and gas was observed by surviving villagers on nearby hillsides as a fountain rising perhaps 80 meters above the lake's surface. The water level dropped by about a meter overnight. The gas itself rose first as a tight, cold, dense column, and then, because carbon dioxide is roughly 1.5 times denser than air, it began to fall. It fell over the lip of the crater. It poured down the valleys to the north and to the west. It was, in physical behavior, much closer to a flood of water than to a cloud of smoke. It hugged the contours of the ground. It moved at somewhere between 20 and 50 kilometers per hour. It was approximately 50 meters thick, and it followed the same paths that water follows, down the valleys, through the streets of the villages, into the doorways of houses where families were sleeping. Carbon dioxide is not toxic. It is what every breathing animal exhales. At low concentrations, in mixed air, it is harmless. But at concentrations above approximately 15% of the air being inhaled, it displaces oxygen so completely that a person can lose consciousness in a single breath and die in a few minutes. The gas that flowed into the houses around Lake Nyos that night was somewhere between 20 and 100% carbon dioxide. In the villages of Nyos, Kam, Cha, and Subum, almost no one woke up. Those who did, who tried to call out, found themselves unable to make sound. Joseph Nkwain's account, that he could not speak, that he could not walk, that he watched his daughter die without being able to move, is consistent with the medical signs of acute carbon dioxide narcosis. The gas is heavier than air. It pools low to the ground. A child sleeping on a floor would have died first. An adult standing might, for a few moments, have had access to a layer of breathable air above. The few hundred who survived the night, on average, lived in houses on higher ground, or had, for whatever reason, been awake and on their feet when the cloud arrived. By the time the cloud dissipated, in the dawn of the 22nd, 4 villages, several hamlets, and an unknown number of isolated farmhouses had been emptied of life. The international scientific response began within a week. Teams arrived from France, the United States, Italy, the United Kingdom, and Japan. They measured, they sampled, they installed thermometers, They lowered instruments into the lake. They confirmed within the first month that the carbon dioxide concentration at the bottom of the lake was still extremely high, that the lake had vented a fraction of its dissolved gas, perhaps as little as 10%, perhaps as much as half, and that the rest, over the next 10 or 50 or 100 years, would continue to accumulate and could erupt again. There was no precedent for what to do. The eventual solution, designed by a French team led by the engineer Michel Halvax, was elegant in its mechanical simplicity. A vertical pipe was lowered into the lake. The bottom of the pipe rested at a depth of about 200 meters. The top of the pipe extended a few meters above the lake's surface. A small pump was used once briefly to start a flow. Once water from the bottom of the lake had been drawn into the pipe and reached the upper section, the pressure on it dropped. Dissolved carbon dioxide began to come out of solution, and the now frothy mixture became like champagne in a shaken bottle, light enough to rise on its own. The pump was switched off. The pipe continued to flow under no external power, drawing deep water up and venting gas into the air, a thin jet of bubbles emerging from the top in a self-sustaining loop. The first pipe was installed in 2001. Two more were added in 2011. By 2019, the engineers responsible reported that the lake had been reduced to a steady state. Gas was venting at approximately the rate at which it was accumulating from below. Lake Nyos today is monitored continuously. Permanent residents have not been allowed back into the immediate downhill villages. There is, in Africa, a much larger lake called Lake Kivu, on the border between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It is roughly 2,700 square kilometers in surface area, and at certain depths it contains dissolved carbon dioxide and methane in concentrations several orders of magnitude greater than those that destroyed the villages around Nyos. Approximately 2 million people live on its shores. A degassing project for Lake Kivu has been under discussion for 2 decades. The technical challenges are not the obstacle. The obstacle is funding, jurisdiction, and the political coordination of 2 countries that have spent much of the last quarter century in periodic states of conflict. The science is settled. The engineering is understood. The question of whether Lake Kivu, on some night in the future, will exhale the way that Nyos exhaled in 1986 is not a question of physics. It is a question of whether the work gets done in time. What happened at Lake Nyos was not a freak event. It was a phenomenon that, given the geology of the Cameroon volcanic line, had almost certainly happened before, in periods before human memory, and would have happened again, whether or not anyone had been living downhill. The deaths were not, in that sense, caused by the lake. The deaths were caused by the gap between what we understood and what we needed to understand. Lake Mannone had given 2 years of notice. The Cameroonian government had commissioned a report. The report had been filed. The villages along the slopes of Nyos had not been warned because nobody with the authority to warn them had read the report carefully enough to be alarmed. There is a phrase used in disaster response circles. It is that catastrophic events tend to be obvious in hindsight and invisible in foresight, and that the work of preventing them consists almost entirely of taking small warnings seriously before they have anything large to teach. 1,746 people died in the villages around Lake Nyos because the lesson of Lake Mannone had not yet been learned. Next file from the engineering files, the Tay Bridge disaster of 1879. The night an entire railway bridge in Scotland collapsed into the Firth during a winter storm, taking a train and 75 people with it.